Having said this thing, as my book is in English language, and I'm equally fluent in Arabic, Persian, and Urdu and Punjabi and English, at least 5 languages I can speak in that way. But as far as this book is concerned, Hazrat Iqbal Rahmatullah Alayh has said in one of his verses about Goethe, he says that Uze Afrangi Jawanan Misle Barak, Shola Yeman Az Dame Pirone Shark. Wo Afrangi Jawanon mein se hai, like a lightning he is, but my flame is kept ablaze by the spell of the sages of the East. This is what Iqbal says. And why I have written this book? People were telling me and telling again and again that Iqbal was under the influence of the Western philosophers. I have tried to prove in this voluminous book that Iqbal was under the influence of the Eastern sages like Rumi, like Hallaj. I mentioned about Mahmud Shivastri Rahmatullah Alayh, Shahabuddin Sohrawardi. I mentioned about Jalaluddin Rumi in detail, Salai Ghazanvi. And there are 2 chapters on Mirza Asdullah Khan Ghalib in the end. And then I have mentioned in one of the chapters in this book about the influence of Quran on Allama Iqbal's intellectualism. So this book actually gives the background of the knowledge of great poet of the East who was under the influence of the great sages of the East. The first sage which I have mentioned was a pre-Islamic prophet of Iran. His name was Mani, and Mani was actually executed by the order of king of the Persia in 272 AD. It's very important to understand this thing. And that was Shapur the second. Shapur, one of the great Sasani king of the Persian Empire. He ordered him to be executed in public in the city of Babylonia. So Mani has tried to reconcile between the Christianity and Zoroastrianism. And followers of the Manis, they were called as Zindiq. I'm not going to go into that detail, but Mani gave the new idea, and actually he revolted intellectually and philosophically against the mighty Persian Empire, which used to rule the 40% of the population of the world at that time. So the great Mani is the first of those. Ghalib has mentioned about Mani. Farsi bin tababini kandari klime khayal Maniyo ar yangamo in nuskiyar tangre manas. Iqbal has mentioned Mani in detail in his PhD thesis. Then I have mentioned about Bayezid Bastami Rahmatullah from the early days sages of Islam and how this Sufism has come in Islam. Actually, the Arabs had no intellectual basis. They were pagans. Once Islam came, Islam gave them the wisdom and intellectualism, and they adopted it. But the Persians, on the other hand, as I have studied in detail, the Zoroastrian religion, they had a strong intellectual basis. While they accepted Islam, they went through a painful phenomena of reconciling Islam according to the tenets of the Zoroastrianism which they had for centuries with them. And while reconciling, they retained those ideas of the Zoroastrianism which were not incompatible to Islam. That's very important. And this process started with Rasulullah because Siddiq says that in late nights, Rasulullah used to sit with Salman Farsi, and I used to envy about the talks which they were having. They were taking long time, and they were trying to reconcile. And Salman Farsi was one of the first professors of Ashab Sufa who used to teach the people about the intellectuality and intellectualism. So Islam is actually what Iqbal has said, that عرب کے سوز میں ساز عجم ہے، حرم کا راز توحید امم ہے، توحید سے ہے اندیشہ غرب کہ تہذیب فرنگی بے حرم ہے. And then what I have said, after that, after Waheed Bastami, I have mentioned in detail Hallaj. Hallaj went through a painful phenomenon against the Arab imperialism. And Iqbal says that Hallaj has got some intellectual revelation, some intuitions, which could not be understood by the people of his time, and it led to his assassination. Mandai Hakra Bidawra Bihtan. Iqbal says that they have actually crucified the man who was telling of Haqq. And when Iqbal asks him in Javeed Name, what happened with you? So he says, Hallaj answers Iqbal, Anjaman Gardam, to Ham Kardi Betars, Mashri Barmurde Avurdi Betars. What I have done, you are doing the same thing. And you are also creating resurrection on the dead people, and you should be worried about that you can face the same wrath of the people which I have faced. So I have mentioned in detail about Hallaj. One of the non-Persians, only non-Persian which I have mentioned in this book in detail, is Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, a man from Andalusia, from Spain, of Arab descent. I have mentioned about him, and he was also under the influence of the Persians. His own teacher was Persian. Hazrat Shirazi was his teacher, and his wife was a Persian, the beauty, who was the daughter of his own teacher. And Badruddin Kolvi, who was his stepson, he was very good friend of Jalaluddin Rumi. Then I have mentioned in detail about Sanai Ghazali and his thoughts. And Iqbal says, Sanai ki adab se maine gawasi na ki warna abhi is bahr mein baki hai lakhon lolwe lala. And then about Sanai, he has got long poems in Bali Jibreel as well as in Masnavi Musafir. Kuft dar khawka Shakime Ghaznavi, Az Nawaye Udile Mardan Khabi. At Ghazni, when he was there, he went to the grave of Sanai, Iqbal all alone, and he closed the doors of his tomb and was sitting for quite some time and talking to the ruh of Sanai, which he has mentioned in his book in detail. And Sanai was the person, about Rumi says, Sanai ru budo, attar do chashpehu, maaz pase Sanai attar hamadin. Sanai was the spirit, and Attar were the two eyes of that spirit. And what I am just following, Rumi says, I am following Attar and Sanai. And then I mentioned about Jalaluddin Rumi, the great, great, great saint whom Iqbal takes as his spiritual guide in detail. I have given 2 chapters on Jalaluddin Rumi. One about Rumi's influence on India, even in Sindh, Abdul Latif Bhatai and other saints, Buhari Kalandar I have mentioned in that detail, even the influence on the kings. Jahangir writes in his Tuzke Jahangiri that my father was not well-read person, Akbar, but at least Diwan-e Hafiz and Masnavi Maulana Rum was recited in his court, and he used to take interest in that. And then I have mentioned about another great man, Shahabuddin Sohrawardi, who was assassinated, a great, great Persian thinker, at the age of 34 years of age, by the order of Salahuddin Ayyubi. It's painful to say this thing, but this was another side. Salahuddin Ayyubi being a good gentleman who has actually relieved the Muslims of Palestine, and he has reoccupied Jerusalem. But one blemish which is on his face is the murder, assassination of this great man Shahabuddin Sohrawardi. And Iqbal says the great man Shahabuddin Sohrawardi, who was the leader of the Falsafa Ashlaq, in his face was the comeback of the old Magian Zoroastrianism into Islam. Falsafa Ashlaq, Shahabuddin Sohrawardi. And then I mentioned Mahmud Shibastri, Rahmatullah Alayh, a great man from near Tabriz. Iqbal says زہدی شیخ تا ان روزگاری نزد مردی به جان معاشراری. After that great sheikh about whom he says کہ بطرز دیگرت مقصود گفتم جواب نامہ یہ محمود گفتم. I have changed my style of writing and I am actually now following this pattern of Sheikh Mahmud Shabastri. And then he says, Sheikh has died 800 years ago. But after his death, nobody has kindled the spark of life in the heart of anybody other than that Sheikh Mahmud Shabastri. There's no time, I'll not go into detail about Shabastri. And then I have mentioned after another lady, Tahra Qudratullain, who was a dissident. She left Islam and adopted another religion. But the way she faced the Mullaism and prevailing monarchy, she was again assassinated and thrown in the old blind well in Tehran and killed in 1854, left her mark. She was the greatest poet of Persia and a sign of revolution, a sign of the feminism. Although we don't agree with her religious views, but the way she is, Iqbal says, Ghalbo Hallajo, Khatum Ajam, Shoraf Gandidar Seni Haram, Ghalib Hallaj, and this lady from Persia, they have actually created dyes in the haram, and haram is shaking due to these people. And the last great sage which I have mentioned, please listen, he was no other than Mirza Asdullah Khan Ghalib Rahmatullah Alayh, a great Persian poet who is being presented as a joker by the Indian media, and we are accepting. Nobody has written better Naat of Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam than Ghalib. Whole Persian poetry of Ghalib is a philosophical, intellectual. I have not seen a single man of his caliber intellectually in that part of India. The man who was revered by Mufti Sadruddin Azurullah of Delhi, who was a great friend of him, Maulana Fazl Khairabadi, and the person who wrote his Marsiya was nobody else than Maulana Altaf Hussain Hali. Those great men who were around him, that they were the men of the religion, men of the literature, and Ghalib is being ridiculed by the people. You have not read of the Persian poetry of that man. And I have read in that detail, which I have given the gist of the Persian poetry. And then in the last chapter, I have mentioned the influence of Ghalib on Iqbal. And Iqbal was deeply influenced by Mirza Ghalib. And I say, if Ghalib would have not been there, Iqbal would have not been there. And I am not only the only person, Sir Abdul Qadir writes in the preface of Bange Dara, that if I have believed in the reincarnation, then I would have told that Ghalib's soul and spirit, after going to another world, was so anxious that after 9 years it came back in the form of Iqbal, and Iqbal is the reincarnation of Ghalib, all the values which are brought. And then I have mentioned about Iqbal in that detail. I've actually used most of the Persian verses of Iqbal, which I have translated in English, and I have given the detail, and I have tried to give the idea that Iqbal was deeply influenced by these great people. And the last word which I was just telling day before yesterday on Pakistan TV on Iqbal Day, I was asked why Iqbal wrote in Persian. Why? Because Urdu is just 200 years old language introduced to us. There was some poetry, but no prose of that. Persian 3,000 years ago. All of our elders and ancestors have written in Persian. Iqbal has read the Persian. And when someone said, what has happened to Iqbal? He has suddenly become a poet of Persian. He said, no, it is not sudden, all of a sudden. I have read 200 divans of the Persian poets, memorized them, digested them. And then they have started coming back in my form. Just to introduce you people
what the Persian poetry was and how it influenced Iqbal, why Iqbal wrote in Persian. And unfortunately, this is the first generation of mine. And tragic, my grandfather was fluent in Persian, my father was bilingual. I am fluent in Persian, but neither my son nor my grandson, they understand Persian. For the last generation, with the tradition is dying down, and now we say Persian is the language of Iran. Afghanistan, I differ. I say we share language with Iran, and Iran is probably the only country which is still keeping that tradition, which have been lost in this country, and it has died down.